Hello, I'm Hal Lublin.
And I'm Mark Gagliardi.
Since the dawn of humanity, one issue has gone unsettled. With the fate of the world in the balance, we're here to settle, once and for all, best decade for film.
That's right. Don't worry, everyone. We got this.
Podcasts should have a theme song. Podcasts should not have a theme song. Yes, they should. No, they shouldn't. They sound good. Yeah, but people are just going to skip past it. You know what? You're right. We got this.
All right, Hal, you're sitting down at the cinema. You're getting ready to see a movie. You've got a popcorn in front of you.
Yes.
What era do you want to be surrounded by in the theater that you are in? In this imaginary world that pops up, where are you?
I've been thinking about this a lot. I think about it a lot in general. I constantly am thinking about what are my top movies of all time. Being serious. That seems like a joke, but I do think about it a lot. And what's difficult about this is I think we really have to spend some time figuring out what our criteria are. Because there are amazing landmark films from the 30s, 40s, even the 20s, the 50s, 60s, then the 70s come, the game changes altogether, and you think like, oh, well, they've set now all of these templates for the way we're going to make movies moving forward. Then the 80s come and they do it all over again. So it feels like every couple decades, there's a renaissance, either technologically or in how you put the narrative together, or just like one of the greatest of all time doing their greatest work. Right. So I could sit here and say the 80s because Back to the Future's in it, but nobody has Back to the Future. It wasn't in the original AFI 100 Years, 100 Movies list.
You seem really insulted by that. Yeah. I was wondering why it wasn't in there. Because look, it's won multiple episodes of this show.
It has.
It has come out on top.
You know what the problem is?
It's your favorite movie of all time.
We need to go back to 1998 and tell them. But that's the thing. Like, I actually sat, you know, neither of us are a Craig Kukowski who has the ability, the callback and ability to create a list of like, he has a list of his favorite, you know, that Craig's list. We were there. We had dinner with him and he was explaining the list to us before that show even existed.
Oh yeah. Just the fact that he had this list.
Yeah. So I was sitting there. I was like, all right, what are my top 10 favorite movies of all time? And I spent time on that. And that was just so much for someone who spent like hours cataloging his Star Wars toys that we acquired just to get to sit down and make another list. Yeah. That was pure bliss. And then I started going, well, what do I think are the greatest films of all time? And that was a different challenge. I'm bringing my list up right now. So I have it in front of me. And I didn't even finish my top 10 because I got to a point, I reached an impasse with myself.
And which decade are we talking about here?
This is all over the place.
You're talking about just a general top 10. So your idea was that you were going to see which of the movies in your personal top 10, if there was a particular decade that was better represented than the others.
I was just curious to see, like, what do I have in my top 10? There is one movie that I have both in my favorite movies of all time and in what I think are the best movies of all time.
With this, your personal, what you think are the best movies of all time.
And it's number 5 on both lists.
Interesting.
Not on purpose. I was just sitting there going like, oh, I even moved it around. Like I spent all this time thinking like, what does it have to be like? I have It Happened One Night, which was, I believe was released in 1934.
Yeah.
As one of the greatest films of all time.
Sure.
And to watch it now, you wouldn't really think much of it because you go, oh, this is just a formulaic romantic comedy. But that formula didn't exist until that movie existed.
Right.
Does that make it important versus the best? Like that's the distinction we have to make.
Well, that's what we do on this show.
Yes. I can't stop talking. This is my turn. This is my episode. Next episode.
Yeah. It seems like you've already figured this whole episode out. Hold on a second now. Do you have a script in front of you right now?
It's more of like a loose outline.
Oh my God. You know what's funny about the way that you and I both approached this topic? Because I also took this very seriously because it's a big question, the best decade for film. Yeah. And this is why you and I have a show, my friend. And this is why I love you, my brother, is that we approach things from very different angles. When you said, what is the best decade for film? My thought was, let's take a look at what happened in each of those individual decades that moved film forward as a whole, as a grand concept of American cinema.
Okay.
So I think that as far as looking for criteria to look at, I think that we can look at both what films did to the world in that era, as in which movies are the best ones and which ones come out on top. And if, those we wind up pitting against other movies from other eras, but also what the world did to movies in that time, meaning how the medium moved forward, talking about, 1967 when Bonnie and Clyde comes out and boom, movies have changed forever.
Sure.
Specific eras of time. Because I think if we look at it that way, there are a few eras that are very specific. And I think the Venn diagrams of knowing your tastes of your personal favorite movies are going to overlap in at least one instance with, I think, a really important, specific, particularly prosperous and flourishing time. So I think that we can look at this from two different sides.
I feel like I went into this and in my brain, I had three, just when the idea came to me, because I reached out to you this, and I'll tell you the impetus for it later. I don't feel like that's the story for right now. And also in my script, it doesn't come till the third act.
Sure.
But
is this the PDF? Is this PDF Final 1 or PDF Final 1A1?
I'm going to send you the new one, which is,
dang it,
PDF Final 1.B.2. But I'll send you the drafts in between so you can see the changes and see if you have any notes. In my brain, there were 3 decades that stood out to me right away.
Yeah.
And of those, I have one that I think is the answer, but I'm not coming at it from a position of this is the answer and you have to prove me wrong. I just had an instinct immediately. And the more I think about what you just said and what I said, I think I may be onto something. However,
I think you may as well. I think I already know what you may be onto.
Do you want me to tell you what the 3 decades are?
No, because here's what I would like to do.
What do you want to do?
I would like to combine these 2 ideas. And because this is a chronological question, I think we can go chronologically through the decades of cinema. We'll begin with a little bit of what happened with film in that time, and then talk about our favorite movies from that era and some that we think are objectively the best movies of each of those. And some of these we can get through quite quickly, like the 1910s. Sure. The movies, the camera all stayed in one spot the whole time. And then D.W. Griffith invented the feature film, but we are not going to pick D.W. Griffith in 1915's Birth of a Nation. There's no way in hell that the 1910s, with that being the case, are going to be the time. So then we move into the 1920s. Do you have any favorite movies from the 1910s?
No, I do think Birth of a Nation, the reason why it gets discussed, the reason why it was even in the initial list, which granted was in 1998, not 2022.
But still,
is what it contributed to the filmmaking medium. Yeah. Is it an aberration and an embarrassment? Yes. Did it also create a way to make films that were longer than a couple of reels? Yes. Is Gone with the Wind an amazing adaptation of a popular book that is one of the biggest films of all time, and the look of it and the performances in it? Does that make it an iconic film? Yes. Is it highly problematic from the second it begins?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So there is a balancing act that we have to do here. That is the same conversation. If we I'm telling you, Mark, I pictured in my head the two of us I've somehow agreed to go to a bar with you.
I was just going to say, I've somehow agreed to go get pie at that place in Philly with you that has the Yiddish dictionary signs when you walk in.
Oh, the Ben and Irv's?
Yeah.
Sure. Either place. And we're just sitting
look at us, the gift of the Magi. I'm sitting at the diner with a piece of pie. You're sitting at the end of the bar like Norm, but with a fruit punch.
And we've shaved Ken's head and stolen his watch. But I imagine this discussion, and this is part of it, right? There are going to be films in here that are not endorsements of the films, but just you have to recognize at least what it did for the genre moving forward. Like The Usual Suspects is a really good film. A lot of people involved in that film, not the greatest people.
Sure.
And their transgressions vary from severe and horrifying to just wrong-headed and public about it.
Yes. So, and those, I will say, though, are personal transgressions, horrific personal transgressions.
Absolutely.
And stories that affected only a few people. D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation brought the Ku Klux Klan back.
That's true.
That is, yes, that movie, and how forcefully can a pendulum swing that the same movie that invents the close-up brings back the Ku Klux Klan.
100%. And that's like the range we're working in, right? It goes from this film is an egregious affront that brings back the KKK, that glorifies racism and tells this severely whitewashed story.
Mm-hmm.
And here's a really good movie that's engaging, that unless you're my dad, who's the only person on the entire planet who's like, I saw it coming, of Usual Suspects, where it's the people involved are a problem.
Do you think he really did?
I don't know. I think he thinks he did. I don't know.
Sure.
I don't get what that is. I really don't get that part. I don't know that that's something I inherited from someone who sounds like him and looks like him and has a lot of his behaviors. That one I just never got. I was like, really? You couldn't
coming out of a movie with a twist ending and saying, I called it, is a hilariously obnoxious thing to do. Yeah. And I love everything about it. I called it.
Walking in with like a Clue, one of those Clue flip books so you can mark everything off.
You ever want to prove it? You just put it in an envelope first and you seal it. Hey, Hal, hold on to this. No, don't let me. No, you hold on to it. It's got my prediction in it.
I remember him telling me that. I was like, he didn't know. I still think, if you're listening, Dad, I don't think you knew.
Do you have any favorite movies that came out of the 1910s and teens? Tens and teens? What do you call it? Yeah.
Yeah, tens and teens. No, I mean, there's a short, I think from 1912 called 1 a.m.
Sure, Chaplin.
It's a Chaplin coming home drunk and trying to get out of the cab, into the door, take his clothes off, get changed, and go to bed. What should take probably about 3 minutes takes, I don't know, 20. It's like a 20-minute.
It's so funny. It's one giant staircase that wraps around the whole thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I will shout out Chaplin in The Immigrant as well. One of my favorites from the time. And also Gertie. Did you ever see Gertie the dinosaur?
Yes. Yes, I have. The animated.
Yeah, but done with I don't remember where I saw it, but I saw the whole thing once. There's an actual human standing next to Gertie.
Yeah.
Who is, you could only do it on a stage in a vaudeville house. So as a weird bridge between two eras, I kind of love that. But it's not going to be the 1910s.
No.
Let's jump into the 1920s. This is the golden age of the silent film. They had figured out a lot of things. It was the era of slapstick, of Chaplin and Keaton and Lloyd, and also, epic new feature films coming out around this time. Yeah. And midway through the decade, they're experimenting with sound, culminating in 1927's The Jazz Singer. Yeah. Al Jolson sings jazz and speaks along with it, blowing audiences' minds and blowing the roof off of movies.
Yeah. Also problematic, more towards the D.W. Griffith scale than the Usual Suspects end of the scale.
Yeah.
However, I mean, you have to note at least that film brought sound to the pictures, proved that it could work.
Yeah.
And that is very impressive. I had to pick a movie from the 20s. I would probably pick The Gold Rush. I would stick with Chaplin.
Yeah. It's so good.
Yeah.
The Gold Rush was my 8th grade first term paper I ever had to write. I wrote about Chaplin. We talked about this when we did our Chaplin versus Keaton episode.
Yes.
And that scene, the scene in the house, like everything that Chaplin did with the sets, the guy was firing on all cylinders once United Artists opened with him, Pickford, Fairbanks. D.W. Griffith keeps popping up. But yeah, it was a troubling time. But the Keystone Cops had come out of Senate Studios, and Fatty Arbuckle, also problematic, but not really through anything he did, through the scandal and the terrible story that he ultimately was exonerated from. But the first Hollywood scandal leading to the beginning of the Hays Code, which didn't start until 1930.
Yes. So let's go into the 30s.
The 30s, I think that break with sound, I think this is the first decade that you had on your list.
It is not.
Really?
However, I do have 2 movies in my top 10 that are from the 30s. One is It Happened One Night, which again, the idea that it's set, first of all, it set the formula for romantic comedies. Second of all, it killed undershirts because of Clark Gable.
Yeah. You're not wrong.
That is the cultural influence that he had and that films had at that time. That's hard to fathom because we're in a fractured media landscape, blah, 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 blah. The other one is another literary adaptation, which is The Wizard of Oz.
Yeah. In the greatest movie year of all time.
1939. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. I think that here's why I think that the 1930s are definitely on the best for film list. Beginning of the 1930s, between 1929 and 1931. Mm-hmm. So sound changed everything.
Yep.
Because now
out of work.
A lot. Yeah. People with terrible voices were out of work. Mm-hmm. Directors could not direct during the shoot anymore. Now there was dialogue to be said as well. Music could be added and synchronized to things. So what happened was between 1929 and 1931, there was this giant brain drain from New York of all of the theater actors, playwrights, Pulitzer Prize winners are coming out, which I don't remember what movie it was that, Steinbeck and, it was later in the 40s. Sorry. To Have and Have Not was Hemingway and Faulkner wrote that screenplay together. Brilliant minds came to Hollywood at the beginning of the 1930s, and slapstick gave way to screwball, which is why It Happened One Night is such a great example of this era. I think that, and then music, synchronized music and sound effects made it possible for Universal to come out with the Universal Monsters and have their boom in horror movies. MGM started making their giant musicals. By the end of the decade, everything was in color. And the decade that began with all of the writers and actors and directors moving west to combine into this one big artistic soup ended with the greatest year of movies of all time. It is a tough decade to beat.
You do have Duck Soup, which is an amazing film by the Marx Brothers. That
I love Duck Soup.
Their greatest film, hands down.
Yeah.
Man, I love a Horse Feathers also.
Horse Feathers is the one where the set wobbles and the extras are mouthing Groucho's lines during one of his songs.
Yeah.
I love how janky Horse Feathers is.
But Duck Soup is a masterpiece.
Yeah.
I do think it's great.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree with you. 1939 may be the best individual year in terms of stuff that came out.
And the year before that, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs introduces
first Disney film.
Introduces the first feature-length Disney film.
Okay, I agree with you.
I think this has to be a finalist.
I don't think I'd considered it enough. I think the 30s are a finalist. I also think the decade that follows is also a finalist because it features arguably my number one greatest film of all time. Not in my top 10 favorites, but certainly everything's arguable, right? Until we say it's not.
Exactly.
Citizen Kane.
Yeah.
Citizen Kane changed the way we make movies. So we got the close up from D.W. Griffith. We got almost everything else from Orson Welles. And how he made that film, the way it's put together, like all of those things are things that hadn't been done before. So he comes and revolutionizes how you can tell a story, drawing from his theater experience, drawing from the success he'd had in radio. He comes in and tells this story that is the story of Charles Foster Kane, which is basically William Randolph Hearst. And it almost like disappears. Like the story of it is crazy, but it is undeniably one of the greatest films of all time.
It's stunningly beautiful. I recently watched it again within the last year, and I forgot how great it is lit. You know what I mean? It's the best use of it's like, okay, it was a bunch of theater people going, okay, now we're working in film. Well, what is film? It's light. It's dark and light on film, on celluloid. Okay. So Orson Welles and, the Mercury Theater and those folks created such an amazing, beautiful piece of art. They were out of RKO Pictures. And I want to bring this up because this whole chunk of time right here is really kind of one era, right? It's like the 30s up through the 50s was all the golden age of Hollywood. And the 40s, I think you're right, is where, it really hit its stride with the best of the stuff. And you've got 5 major studios, right? There's the big 5 studios. Mm-hmm. RKO was famous for taking risks on movies, and they were the ones that did Citizen Kane. Mm-hmm. At the same time, 20th Century Fox has John Ford, and they're making Westerns going into the 40s. You've got Warner Brothers, the studio of the working class, doing its melodramas at the time. Mm-hmm. Paramount is letting the filmmakers, really, really shine. Yeah. And MGM is making its big, huge musicals of the 1940s. I love me a 1940s musical. You know what I love? I love a cornfield that is so clearly a set that they're not like where the clouds don't move for the weeks that the story is being told. They're in the exact same spot. I feel they don't even bother trying to fool me.
Here's what I love about the 40s.
Yeah.
Is because we are in World War II for a significant portion of, or at least a lot of the early part of the decade, 41 through 45, we get a run of films made both during that time, like Casablanca made in 1942, which is not only present in the moment, but also one of the greatest films ever made. Yeah. It stands as a masterpiece to this day. It 100% holds up for what it is, which is incredible. You also get Capra, and he's already done, it's so interesting to watch. In 1939, one of the greatest movie years, if not the greatest of all time, he makes Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Yeah.
With a young Jimmy Stewart who is still innocent and he's still going to go do a lot of his early stuff. Then he goes to war and he actually sees some stuff. And when he comes back to do It's a Wonderful Life, that's a different Jimmy Stewart who comes back and does that in 1946. But I think those movies are set just the 1-2 punch. If you left it at Citizen Kane and then Casablanca, that might be enough for me to say, oh, so we have the person who invented modern filmmaking, and then the movie everybody knows, even if they've never seen it.
Yeah.
Like, that movie.
I think it's got
quotes from it. It still lives.
It's 2 of the greatest movies of all time. 2 of the, top 5 are from that one decade. If we're just looking at the numbers, both of those movies are top 5.
The theater people are still going. You have Olivier's Hamlet in 48. And speaking of what it is to be in the war, what is it like to come back from the war? And you have The Best Years of Our Lives.
Yes.
Where an actual veteran who has lost his hands comes in and is essentially playing a version of himself and wins an Academy Award for it.
Yeah. There's really, I would split the 40s in half. You've got the wartime 40s when, they couldn't really make, they're making propaganda movies. Disney's over there making, Victory Through Air Power. Everybody comes back from the war in the late 1940s and you get there's all of this money that the country is suddenly flush with, right?
Yep.
So you get these and everybody's seen a little something like you mentioned with Jimmy Stewart.
Yeah. You also get the beginning of sort of Hitchcock's rise. I know he starts in the 30s, but you have Rope and Notorious.
The studio system is chugging along. The genre pictures are working. Yes. They're firing on all cylinders. Yeah, you've got
goodness.
Yeah.
Big Sleep. Come on.
We're at the peak.
Sierra Madre, Maltese Falcon.
We're at the peak right now, Hal, of the golden age. We have to take a break.
All right.
Let's take a quick break and we'll be right back with more. We got this with Mark and Hal. But in the meantime, let's hear about some of the other great shows on the Maximum Fun Network and some of the folks that sponsor this show. We'll be right back.
This episode is brought to you in part by Trade Coffee. Mark, you are a noted coffeeman. You're the coffeeman of this show.
I don't know that I'm a noted coffeeman, but between the two of us, I'm definitely the coffeeman.
I mean, in my world, you're noted as a coffeeman.
Oh, thanks, buddy. In my world, you're noted.
Well, thank you. You've been on the trade train for a while. You've tried a few different coffees. What is it you like about the process? What do you enjoy so much?
Sure. I love Trade Coffee. The reason I love Trade Coffee so much is the variety, not only of flavors that they have. I like to mix it up. I'm not a one coffee person. I like to change things up, see what I like from different regions, different growers, different notes within my coffee, different roasts even. And all of this is customizable. That's the big thing for me is I go on the website for Trade Coffee. I can customize exactly how I want it, right down to the fact that I use a reusable K-cup. And so they account for that and get me the perfect grind for that and coffees that are specifically good for that kind of system. So it really is a super personalized version of drinking coffee that still gives great variety. I don't think I've had the same coffee twice, and I've loved everything they've sent me. They have excellent taste, which if you're a coffee company is probably a good idea.
And that's because they have 450 different types of coffee live at any given time. And they are actually taste testing all of these coffees to see what's going to be in rotation and what isn't. And that's why they're so confident that they're going to match you right the first time, that if you don't like what you get, that is okay. An actual coffee expert will work with you to send you a brand new bag for free. They want you ultimately to find a coffee that is going to be right for you. And that is like a dedication to not only quality, but just having a good experience in getting the coffee that you're going to love.
And they're batting 1,000 right now for me because I've loved all of the coffees they've sent. So keep them coming. And right now, Trade is offering new subscribers a total of $30 off your first order plus free shipping when you go to drinktrade.com/WeGotThis. That is more than 40 cups of coffee for free.
Get started by taking their quiz at drinktrade.com/WeGotThis and let Trade find you a coffee that you'll love. That's drinktrade.com/WeGotThis for $30 off. And now, on with the show.
The greatest thing to happen to radio.
We've got thrilling adventures and chilling suspense.
In the briefest time, I feel like we got to know each other.
Bro, I appreciate you so much for that.
Do you read minds or what?
It's really a very sacred space you've created here.
Bullseye! You've hit the bullseye, baby! Bullseye. Interviews with creators you love and creators you need to know. From MaximumFun.org and NPR.
Hey! Did grad school ruin your reading habits?
Oh my God, all those books you had to read for grad school.
Did becoming a parent destroy your ability to focus on a book? Did the pandemic tank the number of novels you can get through in a year?
Ugh, that happened to everyone, and we're Reading Glasses, and we're here to help.
We'll get you out of a book slump, dismantle all that weird reader guilt,
which we know you have a lot of, but most importantly, we'll help you fall back in love with reading. Reading Glasses, every Thursday on Maximum Fun.
I had that break scripted in.
How are we doing on your script? How many pages we have left? Are we okay on time?
50.
Great.
50 for the 50s.
So where were we? You were rattling off great movies that came out in the 1940s. The golden age. This is the golden age. This is peak golden age.
Yes.
We move into the 1950s. Yep. Still peak golden age.
Wait, do you agree that the 40s should be a finalist?
I don't think that the 40s are as important as the 30s are for film, but I think that some of the greatest movies ever made came out of there. It's a Wonderful Life I would put on there. Citizen Kane, Casablanca, all came out of the 1940s. So
also, to me, it's Citizen Kane alone carries that decade, but it's not like it's the only good movie and then a bunch of duds. You have that followed by an all-time classic, followed by one of the greatest, if not the greatest Christmas movies of all time. Yeah. You have all these standard setting things that are happening in the 1940s. And it's hard because, you know, in the 30s, sound occurred at the end of the 20s, and then it really went into full force in the 30s. So you got the evolution of all these artists coming in, like you talked about, that bring us to 1939. Mm-hmm. But it to me, that's not it gets better. It's not like Orson Welles is like, oh, I'll just keep making those movies. He absolutely changed the game in terms of technique and craftsmanship and storytelling.
Yeah. But in the way that the 30s ended on such a huge high note, the 1940s do not end so well with the Paramount Antitrust Act that breaks up production and distribution and theaters. That's when they dropped from making 800 or so movies a year to making 500 or so movies a year. Now that's when the decline begins because the monopolies were broken up. Used to be, you know, the studio owned the studio, the distributor, and the theater. They had to break all of that up. So they didn't spend as much money. They didn't hold on as tightly to their contracts on their actors. People started to spread out a little more. And toward the end of the 1950s, people are a little fatigued with the Hollywood ending that came out of the Hays Code. They had a word for it. I don't remember what it was. Something like that. Something virtue. That was the Hollywood ending was like, it was one of the rules. So people started to get disillusioned with that toward the end of the 1950s. But before we jump into the Renaissance, is there anything that pops out of the 1950s at you as really, really standout movies?
Two that really, well, three. First of all, Roman Holiday is just.
What year? I thought that was the early 60s. What year is that?
It was 1954. Maybe
was it?
Maybe I'm mistaken. Maybe it was 1960.
Roman Holiday's so funny.
Two that I know are from the 1950s. One is Rebel Without a Cause. Yeah. Which is like the anthem of a generation, still relevant to this day. And then the other is the one that is number 5 on my favorite movies of all time, and also number 5 on what I think is one of the
Wait a minute, can I guess?
Go ahead.
Is it Singing in the Rain?
It is not. It is not a musical. Singing in the Rain is fine. I like it.
Singing in the Rain is one of my all-time favorites. Might be my favorite.
Not only one of my favorite movies of all time, not only what I think is one of the best movies of all time, but is my number 1 Hitchcock movie, which is Jimmy Stewart back at it again with his broken leg.
Oh, it's being so
murdered
good.
In Rear Window.
Yeah.
The way that movie builds suspense and the way it plays with paranoia and space and what he's going through and his design, like it really is just, it's just a master class in suspense and storytelling. And maybe he tops it. I'm not as big on Vertigo as a lot of people are. We can go into the 60s now. Might as well.
Yeah.
He does.
But yeah, Hitchcock did some of his greatest work in the 50s. And then in 1960, he drops, here's how we jump into the 60s. He drops Psycho in 1960.
Yeah.
Oh,
Psycho's fantastic.
Kills off his lead in the end of the first act. Come on.
It's an incredible movie. It's so good. Anthony Perkins turns in like, I don't think it's appreciated. You're so into like, oh, she gets killed in the shower and the ring, and he dresses up that the next time you watch Psycho, I implore you to just study Anthony Perkins and his performance in that movie. It's so fun. One of the greatest performances ever captured.
It's terrifying.
It's so good.
Just his gentleness.
Yeah. I mean, he's a troubled person. Like you get sort of all the different sides of him. So it's not 100%. He's suspicious, but not, you don't know that it's him.
Yeah.
Some people, my dad probably did in the first 10 seconds, but
hey, look, it's in that envelope in your pocket. Yeah. I totally wrote that. Yeah.
Now when you take that card out of the
it just says he's his mom.
Yeah.
Match the corners. Make sure it matches. Is that the one you signed? Yes, it is. Prestige. So the 60s again, I think is one of those eras that was divided in half because in the mid 60s you have at the 1959, the French start making some really cool stuff and Truffaut wins the Palme d'Or at Cannes and Hollywood notices French filmmakers. And that influence creeps into the United States in the form of, hey, these Hollywood movies with their Hollywood endings are a little, that this is starting to get old. Let's do some cool, fun stuff. Truffaut makes 400 Blows in 59. And then that leads to Bonnie and Clyde in 1967, the French New Wave done American style, which leads to Easy Rider, which leads to what else? There were like 3 or 4 movies that came out between 67 and 69. That was just this new crop of filmmakers came in. And this is what you were talking about before. These big swings you were talking about at the beginning. And I don't know if it's a linear path or if it's a circle or if it's a pendulum.
I think it's
you know what I mean?
I think it's a family circus kid crossing the street. It constantly is.
It's Billy trying to get from the back door to the front door.
Everybody's got influences in common, and then they have other influences that are so much more direct in their work. But it is a time where it feels like more foreign direct. You have Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet, and it's a really all over the place decade thematically. And part of that is where society was pre and post. So you're in this sort of post-Korean War, like this peacetime, and then Kennedy's assassinated, and we're already getting into Vietnam by then. So what society looks like at the end of that decade, I mean, to me, it's one of like the starkest differences between where we are at the beginning and where we are at the end. And the films kind of show that. You've got maybe the golden age of music. You could argue it's in the 50s. I might argue it's in the 60s because you get West Side Story, you get
Oliver,
Hello Dolly, you get Oliver, you get these like Oscar winning epic musicals.
Huge movies.
You also have James Bond and the rise of James Bond in 1962, I think was Dr. No. That was First one. So it's like so all over the place. You got Guess Who's Coming to Dinner. Like you start grappling more directly with these larger issues. And Guess Who's Coming to Dinner is so good.
Yeah.
It's so good in terms of like how it's sad how relevant it remains today, but it does. And it's just great performances all around.
Poitier got the Oscar for that, right?
Yes. I think so. I know he got the Oscar for, in 1963. Well, in 64, he got it for Lilies of the Field, which is also a fantastic, like, that's really like a Sidney Poitier decade.
Yeah.
And he continued to work and turn in fantastic work for decades beyond that. But he really sort of took off. We also get the birth of Mel Brooks as a filmmaker with the producers in 1967 or 68. So you have a lot of these voices that are going to really shape maybe the following decade a little bit more, that are starting to show up and turn in their early work in the late 60s and early 70s. I don't think, because I can't put my finger on the pulse of this decade at all. And I get what you're saying and like the influences there, but to me, it just feels like this is a bridge between where we were and creating the narrative freedom to get to where we're going.
Absolutely. And that was cracked open with, by the way, the other two movies, The Graduate and Midnight Cowboy, joined Easy Rider and Bonnie and Clyde as the movies that moved that along. And what it moved along was Warner Brothers specifically, and then the rest of them followed suit of not making everything in-house, letting these young upstart filmmakers start making their own stuff. Because also this is the time when all of the people that had come up in the 30s making those movies and crafting this thing, they're all retiring, right? So this is the next wave of people coming through. This is that pendulum swinging. This is that Billy, going over the jungle gym, in the Family Circus playground right there.
And Kubrick's getting weird. He's gone
getting weird
from like Spartacus to 2001: A Space Odyssey, which is a landmark movie and a challenge of your will. This is a challenge. If you
this is supposed. And by the way, you know who's saying this? Hal is saying this about 2001.
I know. See, you want me to say anything different? I'm sorry, I can't do that, Dave.
Oh my God!
But it is like a patience tester. It's amazing. A lot of really cool stuff in it. And, after this, sci-fi is kind of gone for a little while.
Yeah.
But I have a feeling in our next decade.
Oh, it's going to come back.
We're going to find a lot of things coming back, and not only coming back, but coming back in an elevated way with a lot more to say. And that is why I think, I knew this one was on.
The
70s is one of the finalists.
Of course. Well, this is, I think what you were talking about, at the end of the 1960s with Mel Brooks coming up and these other artists really coming out of the end of the 1960s. That era began at the end of the 1960s, but this is the 70s era. You're talking Scorsese, Coppola, De Palma, Altman. This is, what they called New Hollywood cinema.
Yeah.
And these guys are making socially conscious, pretty heavy movies. And then along comes the other flip side of that coin of New Hollywood or New American cinema. And that's Lucas and Spielberg who go, let's make some escapist fun, and invents the blockbuster. So you've got two paths of movies happening at the same time, I think. And both are really firing on all cylinders.
Yeah. I mean, look, not only do you have a bunch of people doing their best work, if I could sit here and just like nonstop list great films from the 70s.
Yeah.
Godfather is arguable against Citizen Kane for the greatest film ever made. Mm-hmm. Then you have Chinatown, which brings back the noir, but has a lot more to say about it. You have Star Wars.
And also brings back the problematic.
Yes.
Let's separate the art from the artist. Yeah.
Star Wars not only brings back science fiction and fantasy together in a way that almost hasn't been done before. And also introduces the idea of used space, that things in space are not always clean. It's like dirty. It's been through stuff, but changes technologically, the leaps that Lucas and his group at Industrial Light and Magic, the things that they're able to do, camera techniques, they just they created all these problems in how they were going to tell their story. And then they figured out how to solve them because they had the smartest and hardest working people possible to do it. And they kept, like, he is, if you made a monument to a small group of filmmakers who have the greatest responsibility for technological or just achievements in storytelling and how films are made, there's no question he belongs on there. You have Coppola making not only The Godfather, which is the greatest movie of all time, then he makes a sequel that, in my opinion, is even better. Although, did I tell you this? My parents went to see, their first movie date was to see The Godfather Part 2, and neither of them had seen Part 1, and they hated it because it makes zero. You have to see The Godfather. You have to watch them in order. Don't watch the Corleone saga where they do it. Like, just watch Godfather 1 and then watch Godfather Part 2. Godfather Part 2 is it's unreal how good it is. Like, there's nothing, it's not like they improve.
I'm an Italian. Better. You don't think I've watched The Godfather and The Godfather Part 2 with my dad every year on a holiday when he goes, come sit down. It's at this part. Look, Clemenza's making his sauce.
Coppola also he gives us the Godfather movies, but also gives us the conversation. Yeah. How crazy is that? You have Rocky, which creates you just have all of these amazing, you have the Deer Hunter,
The Exorcist
towards the end.
You've got two of the greatest comedies of all time. You've got Blazing Saddles and
Young Frankenstein.
Well, yeah, I was going to say Blazing Saddles and Monty Python and the Holy Grail that changed comedy forever. I do not disagree with you that the 70s was full of great movies. We're passing it on to the finals. We'll talk about it more, I am certain, in a few minutes.
Sure.
Let's jump to the 1980s. The 1980s, we're seeing the beginnings of the boom of blockbusters. The 80s, if we're looking at the history of movies, this is where things kind of start to, first of all, this is within our lifetimes, and this no longer feels like a history lesson and more like just things that have happened. This is when big corporations bought up all of the movie studios, and studios became brands, and everything became, gone were the days of the studio executive. Now it's corporate boards, and we just want blockbusters.
When people deliver, you have Spielberg. I mean, Spielberg.
Oh, yeah. I'm not saying that blockbusters are bad. You know which movies I go to see.
No, I know. But Spielberg goes from Jaws and Close Encounters of the Third Kind to making, in 2 consecutive years, Raiders of the Lost Ark is released, where he and George Lucas can collaborate in each of them doing the best version of their job to make a movie, and then bringing in Lawrence Kasdan, Jeffrey Bowen, bringing in these great screenwriters to work with them. And then the next year he does E.T., makes this intensely personal film that becomes one of the biggest movies of all time. So Spielberg is this is, I think, maybe his apex, although we're going to obviously revisit a masterpiece that he does in the next decade as well.
Sure. A couple of masterpieces, but his actual personal deep masterpiece that is his calling card. Yeah.
Also, I read an article recently.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to get close to the mic here. I read an article recently. Yeah. Because I think yesterday was the 40-year anniversary of the release of Tron.
Oh, wow.
And Tron, for all of the things that it was not a success at the box office because it cost too much to make, even though it made more money than anything they'd done live action at that time, it just cost too much to make. It was a huge leap forward in how films were made. So that film is like a benchmark that people don't think about as much. I mean, there's CG in Wrath of Khan where they show the Genesis project and stuff, but this was a big deal that they were building. And that's why a lot of it is dark, is let's just make it a dark world where we only have to animate these things because we can't.
That's
can't
great.
Make all
that's
that.
Why it was
can't
dark.
Process. Yeah.
That's as much processor power as we had was that Tron world.
Yeah. By the way,
it's cool now that you can look at the light cycles, and
I do want to go back and say that the 70s also gave us Superman.
Okay.
It gave us a believable superhero film, which is incredible. And then rebirth of Brando as an actor. He became relevant again because of The Godfather after flaming out.
I'm not disagreeing with you that the 70s are going to make it through. Hal, we're talking about the 80s now.
Stick to my script.
Oh my gosh. So look, we grew up in the 80s. These we're going to have an affinity for, obviously.
Sure. Yeah.
You've got John Hughes movies. You've got that whole aiming toward teenagers, that world, and kids and families. Or maybe I'm just thinking about kid and family movies because that's when we were growing up. You've also got Working Girl came out in the 1980s. These are just movies that define an era.
Also, 3 genres were basically either created or codified. One is the slasher film with 1980s Friday the 13th and then 1984's Nightmare on Elm Street and all the films in between and after kind of set like the teen slasher flick. We also got the right guy in the wrong place at the right time with Die Hard. That was new.
Sure. And Die Hard on a blank.
Yes. And the 2 cops who shouldn't be partners and yet they are. And we get the buddy cop movie with Lethal Weapon. Those all happened in the 80s. So it's not like maybe technologically we didn't jump forward that much. We did jump forward some, but in terms of creating genres that we still use today that are still extremely popular, there's a lot going on in the 1980s. Plus you get Back to the Future and a ton of teen like that's really like the teen comedy there as well. Porky's, Revenge of the Nerds, Ski School, Hot Dog.
Look, we're talking about the great movies.
Savage Steve Holland.
Oh my God. How did we talk about Savage Steve Holland? I leave you alone for 2 seconds.
One Crazy Summer.
You also have two movies that come out at the end of the 1980s that changed the game for the next decade. By the way, I don't think the 80s are going to the finals.
Dangerous Liaisons. I agree.
All right, now are you close Wikipedia? Stop reading and talk to me, Hal. Stop reading and talk to me.
Is Who Framed Roger Rabbit one of them?
Yes, it's a great movie.
I'm pointing at the camera. You can't see it.
Yes, Who Framed Roger Rabbit is one of them for its technological innovations. There are 3, actually.
Go ahead.
Batman, which launched the next round of all of these great superhero movies.
Yes.
And, of course, The Little Mermaid, which led to the Disney Renaissance.
Good point.
And really brought them back with Michael Eisner at the helm and all of those great Disney and animated movies that came out of there throughout the 90s, which we're talking about right now. Big, by the way, again, this is all stuff that's happened in our lifetime, but historically what has happened for the movies in this time, we've got VHS tapes beginning in 1980, Betamax in 75, VHS tapes starting in 1980. And that gives us the ability to watch movies at home.
Right.
They at first sold them for $80 to $90 a piece if you wanted them, which set up the rental model, which arguably we're using a newer version of now with renting movies on Amazon Prime Video as opposed to owning physical DVDs anymore. But it led to the creation of really like the late 80s, early 90s of people having movie libraries at home, which as a kid, I loved my movie library. I had my VHS tapes. I still have my DVDs, most of them. I've whittled them down over the years. I'm looking over your shoulder right now, and I see much of your library.
No, those are books.
Those are books? I don't understand.
The DVDs are in giant binders. I have like 9 to 11 giant binders filled with DVDs because I got rid of them in their cases long ago. It took a whole wall of a couple places ago of that place. So I wrestle with getting rid of it all the time because I think I've replaced most of it in streaming and digital. The VHS stuff I have and get rid of it, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But, it's hard to relinquish control of those things when they have like features and stuff like that. And the 90s is a really interesting time in filmmaking. Once again, you have some absolute masterpieces being made. You have, Schindler's List. You have Shawshank Redemption. I would argue that 1997 is it's probably one of the best fields of best picture nominees in history. Here are the movies. Okay.
Okay.
As good as it gets. Good Will Hunting, The Full Monty, LA Confidential, and what should have been Boogie Nights, but instead was for a long time, the biggest grossing film in history and one that I will argue is massively overrated until I no longer draw breath. And let me say, I'm glad everybody who worked on it got paid and did really well. And that is Titanic.
You argued this with me just this afternoon.
And you weren't even arguing against it. I was just like, let me tell you something else.
I was like, oh no, Grandpa's thumbs are going again.
Again, the technical achievement of it is fantastic. And it's, I think there were films more deserving of the Best Picture Oscar that year.
Sure. I mean, that's an incredible year for movies.
But also a major film studio is born and really sprouts up in 1995 with a little movie called Toy Story.
That's right.
You get Pixar. First feature film, the first CGI computer animated feature film that again is like a landmark in using technology to tell stories, and eventually influenced how Disney made their films when they stopped doing traditional animation after Princess and the Frog.
Yeah. And by the mid 90s, the doors have been blown open thanks to home movies and all kinds of new distribution models all over the place. So this is when the content boom really starts to take off with direct to video and new distributors. Like you have New Line and you have Miramax dropping these interesting and, kind of out of left field movies.
Fox Searchlight.
Fox Searchlight. You've got Pulp Fiction comes out, and also these directors that are coming up now, Rodriguez and Tarantino, and these guys who grew up on, who all grew up on that new, what they call it, a new American cinema, that whole second wave. So this is that pendulum / Billy going through the jungle gym again.
I was going to say, wouldn't you say that like the late 60s, early 70s was a lot of great Americans, new American directors who would have been making indie films, but there wasn't really a means to do so. You kind of had to work within the studio system.
Yeah.
And once we get to the 90s, there's a lot more indie film. I would say like between the story of Kevin Smith selling Clerks and what that meant, and the story of Quentin Tarantino and what he did with Pulp Fiction, and before that True Romance, and sort of his rise, really created this, like, it's an interesting time for indie film. There are a lot of really good and very small movies being made that you can enjoy, but it also gave rise to a lot of the tropes of what an independent film is. Like, it's two friends in a car traveling across the country. They don't belong together, blah, blah, blah. And they're just talking. I don't think the 90s is a competitor. I also don't think the 2000s or the 2020s are.
The 2010s.
The 2010s, sorry.
Yeah, at this point, there is so much out there that I don't think we can even, we can look at sort of micro trends from there. But as far as the big swaths that have been cut, I think that it's down to a couple of contenders. I don't know, if I'm being perfectly honest, if the 1940s can hold up to the 30s and the 70s as the two. If we want to narrow it down, I think the 1940s are great. I think it was the studio system at its best, but the 30s invented that system and put all the pieces in place for it, and ended by launching the 1940s with 1939, the greatest movie year of all time.
Here's where I get caught up.
What's that?
Do we take like the first person who ever built a motor car, and like it's kind of rickety, but it works, and then by the end it's like, it's a pretty decent car. And then the next decade comes along and you get like a Rolls Royce. Like, they took everything that was made there and then made the best car. I don't even know about cars, but like they make a great car.
Using that analogy, I would say the 1940s had 2 Rolls Royces.
I think they have more than that, buddy.
What's one? I mean, going by this rationale, it had 2 Rolls Royces, but the 30s had 1,000 Aston Martins.
Yeah, but somebody had a Fiat in there.
Sure, but I think that the 1930s were a more influential, a more important year for movies. It was the first, I think it was more exciting what was happening then.
Mark.
What?
Do you know what we're doing?
Arguing about the 30s or the 40s when the answer is the 70s?
Correct. People of the world. New American cinema? Come on. These people are still making movies. Like, just take a look at everything that was made and the auteurs who rose in that decade. Coppola, Scorsese, Lucas, and Spielberg. Just take the 4 of them. They're not the only ones who are doing great work in that decade. And you have like just this powerhouse of filmmaking and the establishment of the summer blockbuster, the Godfather films, the conversation, like all of these things. And also stuff like Annie Hall, highly problematic, but Star Wars existing. Like all of these things happened within 5 years. Within 5 years, you got Godfather 1 and 2. You got Chinatown. You got Rocky. You got Star Wars. Those are just a few. And we're not even out. Like, once we get out, we get Star Trek coming to the big screen. Not a good movie. I will not hear your defense of it. So You Will Believe a Man Can Fly with Superman. You get Meryl Streep rising to prominence with Kramer versus Kramer. I mean, it's an incredible decade. And if you want to know just sort of what it was like then, I urge you to watch the Paramount Plus series, The Offer, which is a limited series all about the making of The Godfather. It is 10 hours long, and Jennifer and I watched it over 3 nights. And I wish it was a million episodes longer.
Did you just do this? And is this why we're doing this episode?
It made me think about what is the best decade for movie making? Cause I was looking at all the stuff that was happening then, but also looking at what it came off of in the 60s and what the 30s and 40s meant and what's happening now. It just felt like the conversation to have. So the answer is the 70s. It is. If you haven't seen these movies, go watch them. Even the conversation sounds so dull. It sounds so dull, but you will be on the edge of your seat. Your shoulders will be tense in a good way. That is why, just one example of why the 70s is the best decade for film, asked and answered. Thank you to me for coming up with this topic.
Yes. Thank you to you for coming up with this topic and deciding the gentleman who has a Darth Vader over his left shoulder. And underneath that Darth Vader, 2 Darth Vaders, underneath those, a Jabba the Hutt.
That's 80s.
Who knew that this guy was going to pick the 70s as the best decade for movies? Though, yes, you're right. Empire and Jedi came out in the 80s.
Yeah, that's right. Wait till you see my longest yard poster. The big reveal. That's it. That's
well,
it. This topic
thank you to Hal.
You're welcome. I think somebody else suggested this at some point. Maybe that's what's.
I'm sure it's been suggested. This topic is close, but there are many more topics to discuss. So please reach out to us on Twitter at We Got This Tweets, or
you can email us at wegotThisPodcast@gmail.com, or go to our Facebook group. Talk about your favorite decades for film and why. This is what this show is about. It's about having and fostering conversations. Facebook.com/group/WeGotThisPodcast. Thank you to producer Ken Plume, who's great at having conversations over at A Bit of a Chat with Ken Plume, and Force 5, his new video series where he talks to people who collect, you guessed it, Star Wars toys about their 5 favorite figures. Also, I want to thank graphic designer Rick Hillman, Q engineer Jen Alba, researcher Kate McManus. Thank you, Kate.
And of course, thank you to our musicians, Jonathan Dinerstein and Mike Furman, for our score and theme song, respectively. And thanks to you, the people of the world, with whom Hal and I would love to sit down in a movie theater, grab our popcorn. And you know what era it is? It's the late 1970s. We're all looking groovy. We're wearing our best crazy clothes. We're kicked back. Or what?
I'm in a diaper.
I was taking us back in time, man. I was taking us back in time. We're sitting in that theater, and guess what we hear on the screen?
Me crying.
After reading the words a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away.
Me crying because I made a stinky.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. For Hal Lublin, I'm Mark Gagliardi.
For Mark Gagliardi, I'm Hal Lublin. And don't worry, everybody.
We got this.
We got this.
MaximumFun.org.
Comedy and culture.
Artist owned. Audience supported.